Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome so much. Welcome to everybody to our breakout session titled "Funding a Sustainable Movement to End Gender-Based Violence." My name is Raymond Ampil. I work as the U.S. Program Manager for Fondation Chanel. As the U.S. Program Manager, I lead the grant making and capacity strengthening functions of the foundation for our region. And just a brief intro on Fondation Chanel. We are an international corporate foundation that works with our civil society research partners, movement leader partners, to create conditions for women and adolescent girls in all of their diversity to be free to shape their own destiny. And yes, we are funded by Chanel, the brand. So just really brief about me. I come to this work having been born and raised in the Philippines with a certain kind of view as to what domestic, intimate partner, and more broadly, different kinds of violence can look like from a former colonized country. I immigrated not by choice to the United States as an adolescent, where I had the good fortune of cutting my teeth working or being a witness to first queer advocacy during the early to mid 2000s as queer activists were pivoting on their activism around AIDS and continuing to demand better services from city level, federal level responses to the ongoing epidemic that they were experiencing. Anyway, I want to give you also before that a little background as to why, as to the work of Fondation Chanel in the sphere of gender-based violence. We work on three different pillars. One is safety and inclusion, and the next is economic and social autonomy, and the next one is women-led climate resilience. Essentially saying that we know that for women, adolescent girls for our mission statement, which is to be free to shape their own destiny, folks will need to have the safety and freedom from violence in order for them to even start thinking about building the life in the future that they want for themselves, their families, whether that's a career, whether that's a life in other kinds of sectors, what have you, right? That they need this kind of envelopment of freedom from violence and safety. To be honest with you, we did not work in the collective effort to end gender-based violence up until 2019, 2020, primarily because of some of the dynamics that continue to shape both the private sector in general and the philanthropies that are attached to the private sector, which is competitiveness. We said that there are organizations and foundations out there that are already funding the work to end gender-based violence. We don't need to do that. And yet, what we were noticing was that so many of the partnerships and projects at that point that we were supporting were experiencing significant levels of attrition. Let's say it was a workforce development project, right, or partnership or initiative. They were experiencing significant levels of attrition from their participants because they were either needing to move to a different house or a different or needing to leave their homes and go to a shelter because they were experiencing intimate partner violence at home, or they were being priced out of their apartments and needing to leave the city altogether, right? Those similar issues. And we have since made the argument to our decision makers that addressing gender-based violence and working to end gender-based violence is part and parcel and fundamental to our work in order to achieve gender equality here in the US and in other parts of the world. So with that, let me turn to the more interesting people right beside me who are going to share with us their perspectives and the work that they have from their vantage points and constituencies. We have the distinct pleasure and honor to have Aleyamma Matthew and Sonya Passi here with us, both distinguished leaders in the movement to end gender-based violence. First, let me introduce Aleyamma Matthew. Aleyamma is a nationally known expert on the intersection of gender and economic justice. With over 20 years of experience in the philanthropic and advocacy sectors at the local, state, and national levels, she has led advocacy, grant making, capacity building, and campaigns for economic policies to protect women's rights, safety, and economic security, with a focus on women of color, immigrant and refugee women, and low-wage women workers. As executive director at Collective Future Fund, Aleyamma has spearheaded the resourcing and sustaining of efforts led by survivors and women of color. Born in Kerala, South India, Aleyamma is based in Philadelphia, where she serves on the board of directors of the Asian Arts Initiative. She is an alumna of the East-West Center's Asian Pacific American Leadership Program and received a Fulbright Award to study Malayalam in Kerala. Sonya Passi is the founder and CEO of FreeFrom, a national organization transforming our society's response to gender-based violence so that survivors and their families can thrive. To date, FreeFrom has served over 30,000 survivors and successfully changed policy to support the financial security of over 5.3 million survivors in the US. Sonya has been an anti-violence activist since she was 16 years old. During high school, she started an Amnesty International community group and, while working on their Global Violence Against Women campaign, discovered her life's work. While earning her law degree at UC Berkeley, she launched the Family Violence Appellate Project, or FVAP. Based in Oakland, California, FVAP provides free appellate legal services to survivors of intimate partner violence in California and has fundamentally transformed the legal landscape in California. Sonya also holds a BA and Ampil from the University of Cambridge Trinity College. For her work in the field, Sonya was awarded the 2024 Elevate Prize, was listed in Forbes 30 Under 30 class of 2017 for law and policy, and has served as an Ashoka, Roddenberry, Draper, Richards Kaplan, and New America California Fellow.
I'm sorry, I would have made it briefer if I knew you were going to have to listen to it.
Anyway, let's start this off by locating, if I might ask you to locate yourselves and how you come to this work and your current roles, as well as what motivated you to work as a leader in the movement to end gender-based violence.
You put two women on a panel, and this is going to happen a lot. Okay, I'll go. Maybe I can, because you gave a very robust description of who I am, but maybe I can talk about why I'm passionate about today's conversation. FreeFrom has existed now for over 8 years, and our budget is about $9 million. And we are funded by pretty much every single organization, every single foundation in the US that funds gender-based violence work in the US. So last year, I'm looking at our growth trajectory and understanding we need to grow, we need more staff, we need more capacity, the demand is there. It's states wanting to work with us to pass laws, but we don't have the capacity to work with them. And I was like, well, what do I do? I've been back to everyone and asked them for more money. So it can't just be that there's only 16 funders in the US that fund gender violence. And it was abundantly clear to me that the only way that FreeFrom grows is if funding for this work in its totality grows, and that is work that actually needs to be done. And I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about both the issue and also the really creative, really innovative work that's being done to address it that causes people to shy away from the issue or say things like, I love what you're doing, but I only fund health. Or I love what you're doing, but I only fund hunger. And it takes everything in your power to not say, who do you think is hungry? So that's where I'm at in my journey as a leader and why bringing more funders to the table is so important.
Thanks, Sonya. Aleyamma?
See, so now I have to continue on in this sustainability conversation. My name is Aleyamma Matthew, and I'm with the Collective Future Fund. And where I do want to start is actually with why Collective Future Fund got started. And it was started 5 years ago as a response to Me Too Viral and Black Lives Matter. But it was started because already 5 years ago, we knew that there was a crisis around funding in this space around gender-based violence. And at the time, the legacy or the history of funding where we saw the largest amounts of money being distributed was from a federal program called the Violence Against Women Act. And that provided funding for many, many years to a number of to many organizations. And right now, there's been a lot of different challenges that it's been met. In addition to that, the other funder that was funding this work was the Novo Foundation, and that was over $120 million per year that had gone to support and complement social services by supporting organizations doing advocacy and policy work, doing organizing work, healing justice, and really help to support the landscape in being able to grow in doing this work.
I was just going to say, I read a stat recently that Novo Foundation accounted for 95% of all private funding for this issue.
Yes. So I think the difficulty and challenges of doing this work is that almost every single day, every single week, we are seeing some form of violence play itself out, right? So violence isn't a stranger to us, but what is very familiar is the consistent silence around gender-based violence and particularly sexual violence. So I wanted to just set that frame up in what we're walking into in 2024 around what the funding landscape looks like. And so when the Collective Future Fund was created, we were created as a pooled intermediary feminist fund. And it's pooled because currently we have around 12 to 14 donors that have come together and created a Collective Future Fund, knowing that their portfolios don't always support gender-based violence work. But by being part of this pooled fund, they're able to leverage their dollars. We're an intermediary fund because we see ourselves sitting between institutional philanthropic folks like Raymond and movement leaders that are doing this work. And so we take that very seriously of what it means to be an intermediary. And lastly, we're a feminist fund. And at the heart of being a feminist fund is looking at the way that power operates. And that's the way that power operates within the work around gender-based violence, but also the way that power operates within philanthropy.
Thank you, Sonya and Aleyamma. And I think that if we might just do a little context setting here, because the term gender-based violence, particularly here in the US, right, I think needs a little level setting, context setting, because folks, because of many reasons, some of which you named, which is funding sources and the restrictions therein that create sort of unofficially the definitions of what gender-based violence can look like. What do you both mean from your vantage points by gender-based violence? And meaning, how can we as a community of funders, practitioners, advocates, effectively approach the topic of gender-based violence?
Yeah, so the way that Collective Future Fund, the way that we described our grant making is actually that the work we do is at the intersection of racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence. And why we call ourselves as working at this intersection is that we recognize that these different structures, the structure of racism, the structure of homophobia and transphobia, the structure of sexism, right, are all operating. But we use this word intersectionality a lot, but sometimes people know what it means and sometimes it doesn't. But where we see the most amount of violence is at this intersection. So much of our funding is supporting Black, Indigenous, people of color, gender expansive people of color address these issues around violence.
Yeah, yes to everything that Aleyamma said. I think nobody knows, like I don't know what gender-based violence means. Like if you really just took the words as they are at face value, the only reason that we still say gender-based violence is because that's how our funding works. And if we turned around and said, actually, we're going to work on patriarchal, power-based, anti-colonial, white supremacy, blah, 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 violence, no one will know what we're talking about, and so we don't call it that. But it is, we're in this sort of constant conversation about, everyone calls it gender-based violence, but at the same time, nobody wants to deal with gender-based violence. So part of our issue is we do have to reframe the conversation. We have to have it not be this silo that sits over here, but, like Aleyamma was saying, connected at all of the intersections that it exists at, can make people understand how root it is of so many problems that they are working to solve. But I am just waiting for someone to come up with a better term that we all just agree to use.
Well, it's not necessarily a better term, but I think when we talk about the large structural, sometimes we lose the focus of the survivor, and so a term that I think we both use is, what does it mean to center survivors? What does survivor justice look like? So some of the terminology that we've been using is just looking at both how do we center the survivor, but also name the structural forces in place that continue to challenge the survivor.
So to your invitations, Sonya and Aleyamma, let's lift up what those intersections are from your professional and experiential kind of trajectories, right? From economic justice, for example, which you have so adroitly advocated for over the lifetime of FreeFrom and even before, and also on like the multiple intersections of gendered, racialized, sexualized violence, right? That Collective Future Fund works on. Can we uplift some of these like examples from your different kind of locations in this very broad movement?
Sure. So FreeFrom's work really at its core is to reframe gender violence as a systemic economic problem. Why? Because it's extremely expensive to experience gender violence, particularly in the context of intimate partner violence, and we know 50% of all sexual assault happens within the context of intimate partner violence. But survivors are saying their number one obstacle to safety is financial insecurity. It's just, they're financially devastated, they've experienced economic abuse, they have exorbitant costs associated with being subjected to harm. So this is an economic problem. And then on top of that, you layer in, so let me give you a couple of the stats. The CDC estimates that intimate partner violence, will cost a female survivor $104,000. 99% of survivors will experience economic abuse or be subjected to. 60% of survivors lose their job because of the abuse. 58% of survivors don't have safe access to their own bank account. And that doesn't mean they don't have an account. It means they have an account that's being stolen from or controlled. So that is then sort of layered with, but Black and brown women make less on the dollar than white men, white women. So as you layer in the intersections of race, immigration status, ethnicity, the economic devastation becomes even greater. And then we've also done a lot of work collecting data from trans and gender expansive survivors. And their poverty levels are that much higher because of the abuse. So to say that this is happening in a vacuum and doesn't have economic causes and economic consequences is going to prohibit us from ever actually getting to survivor justice.
Well, one of the things, we're getting slightly into narrative by bringing this up, but, a friend of mine told me once when I first started this job that it takes 6 seconds, after I tell someone what I do for a living, before they change the subject, get a drink, walk away, right? And this happens because all of us, right, we have an implicit and explicit, I don't even know if it's called bias, but it's a very challenging subject to talk about, right? And how do we talk about it? What's the resistance? It's something that I feel like I can't even measure in a nuanced level. And as much as it is so pervasive, right? Like the data points, it's 1 in every 3 girls experience sexual violence, 1 in every 4 boys. It's practically this entire room. Even though it's so pervasive, we are still we're still operating in such a way that the funding does not go to GBV. There's a data point that 1.6% of all philanthropic dollars go to women's rights issues as a whole. If you disaggregate that and break that down, it's usually women's health at the top, and women's health is usually like breast cancer research. So when you work your way down that list, GBV is way down on that list. If you intersect, right, that violence with trans communities, it gets even less, right? 0.005%. If you intersect that with race, Black trans people, the zeros in front of the 5 get infinitely longer, and it begins with a decimal point, right? It is no accident that last year we saw 500 trans bills around the country being introduced, right? The canary in the coal mine is usually this individual violence that happens. And maybe there might be individual biases or prejudices or, support that can be transformational. But when we see it land in the form of policy, land in the form of that legitimates vigilante violence, right? We're at a whole new level. And so the urgency that we have as CFF is that how do we increase, not only support and provide resources, but also organize philanthropy to increase the amount of money that there is for gender-based violence. Sorry. No. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think we have to start thinking about gender equity in a much more robust way. And so we have to go beyond the workplace, because gender-based violence happens from the womb till the old age, right? It's happening not just when people are parts of working society, but usually it's happening when you're not at work, right? So I feel like I'm going on, and you should go on. But
well, you just made me think of 2 things. I think we also have to expand what we mean when we say gender violence, because the overturning of Roe v. Wade and anti-trans legislation, 500 pieces of trans legislation, anti-trans legislation, that's gender violence. Like, not having control over your own uterus, that's gender violence. And so it's not just happening in our workplaces, it's not just happening in our homes, it's not just happening in our relationships, it's not just happening in our families, it's very much a public issue. And to connect nobody in this room needs convincing of that, but to connect those dots for people, I think is essential for pulling gender violence out of this like tiny little island that it sits on alone. So that's really necessary.
Y'all are pointing out the chronic underfunding of the work to end gender-based violence, particularly here in the US. I mean, this is something that we experience and that we hear from peer funders in our work to engage peer funders on this topic, is that they would normally say, or they would consistently say, it's important, but that's out of our strategies, right? And so in both of your work right now, which has been focused on trying to open up new channels of funding in this chronically underfunded move to end gender-based violence. Have you reflected on why that's the case? Why this critical work is so underfunded by philanthropy, particularly private foundations that have their significant sources of resources, and why they're not resourcing this movement more sustainably?
I can go. I don't think it's for a lack of care on an individual basis. I think that there is a tremendous misunderstanding about the problem, which comes from the problem living in the shadows and the shame, and it's almost like it's so personal for everyone. There's a very large public foundation. The president of that foundation recently shared that their earliest memory of their mother was them being beaten by their stepfather because they didn't have food on the table when they got home. That foundation does not, that foundation puts pennies towards this issue. So clearly what's happening there is some sort of mental block between the personal and the power that is held to be able to put more money to this. And I think that's true for so many of us. Our unhealed trauma, our pain, our fear that, it's like you said earlier, like this isn't just happening in the workplace or just happening in one relationship. Like this is generations, this is lifetimes, this is trauma that we hold in our bodies that may not even be ours. So to confront it within the current narrative of the problem is so hard. I was once in a room full of funders who pretty much everyone in that room self-identified in that room as a survivor. And when I said, well, why don't you start like a survivors in philanthropy group? And they were like, no way. Because if I go to work and say I'm a survivor, then all of the grants I put forward will be taken less seriously. And, my peers will say, this is too personal for me, I should take a step back. So I think it's the shame and stigma around the issue. I think it's a belief that there is no innovation in this movement, and therefore the only thing to fund is sort of is Band-Aid solutions that are already federally funded crisis intervention work, that a lot of institutional funders are not interested in funding crisis intervention work. They're unaware of all of the deep strategic work that's happening to kind of provide support long before a moment of acute crisis and long after a moment of acute crisis, to build state policy, federal policy, corporate policy, movement building, collective power building. Like all that work exists, and I think folks are unaware of it. And so they have a misconception of what there is to fund. They think there's a lack of things to fund. And then there's just, deep misogyny in our society that says we couldn't possibly have a women's, and it goes under women's despite the, gender neutralness of all of this. But this is an issue that just affects women. So we're going to focus on climate instead, or we're going to focus on, so all of that is at play. And I'm still very much an optimist, and I believe that there's the core people funding GBV, and then there's people considering funding GBV right outside that circle, that if we can get them, then we get the outer layer, and then the ones that have no intention of funding it, in my vision of the future, will be forced to come along because everyone else is doing it. And one thing I do know about funders is FOMO is real.
Sadly, it's true. I think the funding history actually determines why sometimes donors don't give to this. And because VAWA was such a funder of this work, like you said, the perception is that it's service delivery work. But yet this movement has decades and decades of like history, infrastructure, people, leadership, innovations, policies, processes that is unrecognized by most of philanthropy. And and because there has been this chronic underfunding, and also for a while in the DV movement, there were very like volunteer spaces where people came to do this work to support survivors, right? So there's various different histories that make up like how this work is funded, but I think but what I do know is because of this inconsistent funding, what we've seen from activists and advocates is that that activists and advocates working on GBV do exist in immigrant rights and racial justice and climate change and other movements, and I think it has been integrated into those movements. But people who work on, climate change, workers' rights don't always have an articulation of what GBV is. And so I think the one thing that one way that we can change this is really looking at robust portfolios like around racial justice. How can we incorporate and see GBV work and racial justice work? Kimberly Crenshaw's work, Say Her Name, was started to actually look at how racial justice movements often overlooked the violence that was perpetuated by the state on Black women's bodies. And so this is very, very real phenomenon, and I think the issue of explicit and implicit bias is operating there, but it's also this way that we cannot shake this perception of this movement being service bound and long.
And I think it's also the makeup of institutional foundations and who really has final say and final power, and how do we have more representation on boards of trustees or in senior levels of leadership within foundations. Because we know that our program officers are, fighting like hell for us, but the obstacles in front of them are so great.
I wanted to add a comment to something that you both shared, which is that on the funder side, and from what I've seen in the 6 years that I've been with Fondation Chanel, and sort of seeing the conversations internally about this evolution into head-on doing work to participate in the move to end gender-based violence. Again, part of this too is like this completely wrong view that it is sort of like crisis. It's just crisis response perpetually. Which points to us ceding the ground to this, right? We can't end this, so what's the point? But to your point, to both of you, Sonya and Aleyamma, there's so many different leaders who are strategizing in different sectors or from different areas of expertise to make a significant intervention on how this might actually change or end on a very, very fundamental and deep level. On the federal funds federal funding that seem to have a definitional power for everybody, for all of us, on what gender-based violence can look like, VAWA and VOCA even, it's interesting that those are not even safe from persistent threats of cuts. VOCA, Victims of Crime Act, actually being cut significantly, and your domestic violence service providers are persistently then subjected to shocks about where they're going to, how they're going to keep the lights on, even in the multiple crisis response centers that they have. So even in the world that we have kind of boxed the response to GBV in, that in itself is constantly in crisis itself.
Right. I feel like people doing the direct services within the GBV movement are like wildfire fighters. the problem is not that they're not doing a great job. The problem is that our whole society thinks the problem starts when the fire starts. And so that's where they're at. And then, like you said, consistent cuts. Also, who's working in the movement? It's survivors working in the movement. Survivors working in the movement, they're underpaid, they're burnt out, they're re-traumatized over and over again because they don't have the sustainable support that they need. And it's the same people coming in and out of shelters because there's nothing for them when they leave. Because we think of this problem of beginning in a moment of acute crisis, and we think of it as ending shortly thereafter, which is just nonsense.
Well, I was going to add a different kind of data point about a really important crisis that I think we all share. The Global Philanthropy Project put out a report in 2020, and it said that over $6.2 billion was raised by US-based organizations associated with anti-gender movements. And this $6.2 billion was raised to support anti-gender policies here in the US. And in during the same period between 2008 to 2017, at least $1 billion were sent around the world to Latin America, Africa, and Asia to pass anti-gender policies. So when we think about who is fighting in the belly of the beast being the now one of the largest financiers of anti-gender policies, which is right here in the U.S. The people who are fighting here in the U.S., right, are all of you in this room. It's women who are fighting around abortion rights and access, around LGBT rights, around gender-based violence, right? And so this is what the opposition has. While we are playing around with pennies and decimal points, they have been mobilizing billions and billions of dollars that are not just making our fight harder, but also the fight globally.
Wait, so it's 6.2 in the U.S. and another billion has gone outside of the U.S.?
They raised 6.2 between 2008 and 2017. In that same era, they have moved 1 billion, right? 1 billion, and we are now seeing the manifestations of that $1 billion because those 500 trans policies have globalized themselves, right? And in some ways, we saw the rise of very conservative governments way before we saw it in the U.S. It was Mexico, Poland, India, Brazil. Places where we saw both the Me Too movement really come out in the streets and protest, but also large-scale femicide movements were taking place. So, we don't have a lot of time, right? The infrastructure is in place. We're trying to catch up right now.
Can I just ask the audience here, just by a show of hands, how many folks here are just even at a nominal level familiar with the anti-gender movement, more maybe colloquially known as Project 2025? Okay, yeah. So it is something that has been years and years and years in the making, with a factor of 10 times the funding that social justice funders, practitioners, advocates are working with in this movement to end gender-based violence that is survivor-led. And yet, we still see through it all, through the burnout, through everything, for better or for worse, right? We see survivors continuing to stretch the dollar, do what they can with the people that they can to effect change, to come up with solutions. So I'm curious if you might share from your experience and vantage points what some of the survivor-generated policy solutions are. And maybe we can start with you, Sonya.
Sure. We know at this point we've surveyed about 11,000 survivors. And what we know is, first of all, their number one need is cash to spend however they want to, need to. So we both do cash grants to survivors, but we've also worked with over 100 smaller, either local, state, nonprofit cash assistance programs and also been able to get the federal government to put VAWA money towards cash assistance for survivors. We also know survivors have on average $10 in savings, which of course makes, you're like one unexpected bill away from financial devastation. So we, over the last year and a half, have been running a savings matching program for survivors. So matching survivors' savings dollar for dollar until they get to $1,500 in savings, just to help people build that cushion. So, we've invested $500,000, which has resulted in survivors building $1 million in savings, which just, those are good odds, And again, one of the things that we heard early on when we were starting that program was survivors can't save. They don't have the money to save. But that is the misconception about when this problem begins and ends, to think that survivors can't save. We've also, so about 3 years ago, we created a 50-state map and scorecard. And we cataloged the laws of every single state and determined whether they supported survivors' financial security or hurt it. Like Illinois, Washington, and California are like almost really good, and pretty much everyone else is just terrible. Like we did it in colors because we didn't want to offend anyone, but basically like those states get a B+ and everyone else gets a D-. But what was really fascinating, so the map and scorecard, it tells you what's wrong with the law, how to make the law better, it gives you model policy, language to use. Since in the year that we were building that, we saw a total of 3 new laws introduced that considered survivors' economic security, because we kept checking to make sure that we hadn't missed one. And in the 3 years since, we've seen over 600 introduced across all 50 states. We've had about 15 wins in the last 18 months. States are putting in place protections against litigation abuse. Utah now, you are not liable for any future payments or fees if you have to break a lease immediately as a survivor. Tennessee now has the most robust definition of domestic violence in the country, because they included a really robust definition of economic abuse into their definition. So it used to be just physical and psychological, and now it's also economic, which in reality means that, for example, if someone is physically stalking you by seeing where you're making debit card payments, or if someone is taking money out of your account, previously you couldn't get a restraining order against them because that's not considered physical or psychological. It is considered economic. So now it opens up a whole new capacity of how you can get support and get the harm recognized. And then another thing we heard, I said this earlier, but we heard from survivors that 58% of them are having their bank account controlled, monitored, or stolen from. And so we have a federal bill that was introduced earlier this year that would require all of the federal regulatory agencies to gather twice a year to figure out how to deal with survivors' economic abuse within banks. And it would require the banks to start tracking data on the prevalence of survivors' economic abuse. So like baby steps that hopefully then, lead to a situation where we can't hide from the data, and it forces regulators and therefore banks to act. But I mean, our data sets are the biggest I have been able to find of people just asking survivors what they need. And, we need to do more of that, and we need to act on it.
Thank you. Aleyamma?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how to share some of the policies. I'll say that the policy work that many of CFF's grantee partners do happen at multiple different levels. There's organizations like Girls for Gender Equity that has been working in Brooklyn, New York for 20 years, doing participatory budgeting, working in Brooklyn City Hall at New York State level, right? And also helping to sort of nationalize the work that they're doing there. We also have organizations, I think particularly in workers' rights, there's a lot of interesting and exciting things going on. And so many of the low-wage workers' rights groups that are working in predominantly in sectors like domestic work and restaurant industry have all looked at the ways that that the tip minimum wage and being paid below the minimum wage and even having the minimum wage actually is creating a situation where many of them are exposed to sexual violence and harassment. And one of the other really exciting pieces of legislation is actually C-190. It's a policy that was passed inside of the International Labor Organization that looks at sexual harassment and violence in the world of work. And so this has been implemented in a number of different countries, and it also works with, there's a potential to work with local law to implement aspects of C-190. And I'm giving you that range from the local to the national to the global because that is how diverse and broad the policies that are worked on in this sector are.
Last question before we turn to our audience for Q&A is, how do you feel we can, or what are your thoughts on how we can galvanize funders to invest more in this intersectional, holistic work to address gender-based violence and hopefully to end it?
I think it's about faking it till you make it. I don't know, creating momentum where maybe there isn't any, or creating the mobilizing energy around it such that folks are hearing from their peers that they're moving towards this issue, or they're going to this event on how do we, and like creating a conversation that doesn't currently exist and making it cool and making it the hot thing to fund, as vomity as that sounds coming out of my mouth. I think it's about optics. I think it's about building a brand around this work because, every funder that I've talked to about how we bring more funding to this issue, almost the number one thing, if not two or three, that comes out of their mouth is it'd be great if some celebrities were attached to this because we are moved by the national conversation. So great, we're going to create the national conversation. I mean, it already exists, but we're going to create it in a way that's going to get you to invest in a sustainable way, not in just a reactionary way that ultimately would get pulled back.
Yeah, I really appreciated Aijin today kind of laying out the arc of the domestic workers to carrying across generations, just to kind of see, look at an issue in a longitudinally, but also what it took to take an issue that everyone was struggling with, like out of the shadows, and put it into like infrastructure and support. And I think Sonya's right. We do have to raise the visibility on this issue, and the good news is that a lot of folks in here work on policy, workplace justice, and so how do we start to create more data and research around this work? How do data and researchers in the room partner with grantee partners that CFF works with to understand how their community research has been how they kind of frame the work around GBV, what some of their local recommendations and policy recommendations and solutions are, and how do we sort of lift it to a national level. And one more thing I'll say is that, we did get when Me Too went viral, right? Like the whole thing was very, very visible, and that's how it was able to gain the steam that it did. And CFF was created sort of out of that crisis to increase the amount of resources. But in these sort of movement moments, what I wish philanthropy would do is not just have a commitment for 5 years, but really create a 25, 30-year strategy so that we are taking these movement moments and building infrastructure out of them.
Yeah, on that note, I think the other thing that I would add as to how we do it is we've got to tell, we being survivors, have got to tell stories that center our joy and our resilience and our thriving and our fullness. And No one wants to look at pain and tragedy. I do this work for a living. I've done this work since I was 16, and I cannot watch Law and Order SVU. You know, like I cannot watch more violence on screen, no more gender violence on screen. And I think that's what everyone thinks. Like they have that sort of like feeling when they hear the topic. So we need to do more storytelling that's diverse, that's by us, that's for us, that's full of joy, and gives people a vision. Most people are not walking around, one, believing we can never end gender violence, and two, seeing what that looks like. But I think if we can give people the vision and not expect them to imagine it for themselves, it's going to be something that people want to move towards, versus right now what they see, which is this is intractable and this is hopeless and this is just pain.
And with that, we're going to turn to our audience. Hannah over here has a mic. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and she'll come over and hand it to you, and you can ask it to our panelists.
Peace, y'all. Raven Freeborn. I have two questions because I wear two different hats. So first, I am a restorative policy consultant to the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And Mimi Kim asked this question: how and why did the movement to end violence, a movement to end gender-based violence, a social emancipatory movement, choose criminalization as its dominant strategy, right? And so I'm really curious about how you all see carcerality connected to funding. Even as we look at like VAWA, FIPSA, VOCA, where funding is housed is in offices that see violence as a crime. And if we look at how VAWA is broken down, we see like decreased investment in those initiatives that would prevent crime and address it as like a health issue. And so, yeah, that first question is just like, how do you see carcerality connected to funding and what's happening there? And secondly, I'm the executive director of Out Texas. We're an unapologetic abortion advocacy organization dedicated to returning abortion rights to the state of Texas. No big deal, we can do it. And as a Black queer executive director, we're kind of pushing forward to talk about attacks on abortion rights as state-sanctioned violence, and funding, like cycles funding, just isn't enough. And so we really want to think about endowments and how can we kind of start the conversation of endowments as both like a strategy to address the discrimination of folks who are needing abortion health care, but also as like a racial justice initiative. Two small questions. Thank you so much.
Two small, great questions, but
You know, I'll take the first one. Thank you for bringing up Mimi Kim. First, I think the VAWA in terms of funding, right? Like, and the conversation about VAWA, while it was happening, while the money is, and it is, it's under a carceral act. And activists and advocates like Mimi Kim, and the space that she and others created, which was the Insight space. Insight was a convening ground for many, many years of activists that came together that were looking at the intersection of criminal justice, this anti-violence work, and the ways that VAWA was weaving itself in between that, right? And so, and in our work, we actually we support organizations that do not seek out carceral solutions and see this, as part of that. But what I want to lift up is that this is exactly what I mean in terms of like the history and the work that's been done for decades and how we don't always hear about it, because we have been having this conversation about the criminal justice system these past 5 years, these past 10 years, and it's been very, very difficult to elevate this intersection of what does it mean to rely on the police for help and support, especially in communities of color where we've seen the escalation and the consistency of police violence. So that isn't answering your question, but it is saying that we recognize that, and that is also what we're looking to fund. One of the things that I did before joining philanthropy is I worked at a place called Wild for Human Rights that was out in California, and we partnered with a group called Justice Now and the Transgender Law Project. And and as Wild for Human Rights, we worked with these two organizations to document human rights abuses that happened inside of California's women's prisons. And California's women's prisons was the latest extension of how they can make money off the carceral system. And our board was actually all incarcerated inside of the two facilities, right? And it was really reflective of the ways that we were seeing like the expansion of the carceral system to include, right, women and trans people. And I will tell you that when we met with our board of directors, every single person that we talked to, when we did extensive surveys and everything, it almost literally felt like half the people were there because they had been in long-term DV experiences and it was enough. Or they were there because they were thrown out, alienated on the streets from their families because, right, everything that Sonya is talking about, right? So anyway, I just wanted to share that it's very much at the forefront of our thinking, and how do we connect state violence, workplace violence, and intimate partner violence so that we can see the connections and disconnections of those.
Can you remind me the second question? Oh yeah, endowments. I mean, that's the goal. Endowments is the goal. I think before that, even I know so many GBV orgs that don't even have reserves. We had a moment in 2019, the summer of 2019, so we were small at that point, about 2 years old, where I didn't take a salary for like 8 months because otherwise I was going to have to lay people off. And it was so stomach ulcer inducing that I promised myself I would never do that again. And since then we have built a reserve. But it's like, to your point, how can you make the most strategic decision if you're still figuring out how you're going to make payroll 3 months, 6 months from now? And, you know, we say our work is around financial security. It's also part of living that. So we have about 18 months in reserves. I'd like to have 2 years in reserves and then never dip below that, so that we can actually think long term. And if I had an endowment to give you, I would absolutely give it to you. Thank you for doing that work. But it's, I think, first we bring more money in, and then we really think about how do we counter the $6.1 billion and doing this work from a place of that level of security and that level of sustainability, I think, is the only way.
Yeah, I just wanted to say Shake the Table and Bridgespan did make a recommendation that philanthropy should move $6 billion by 2026 into the field. So it's out there in the world, the recommendation.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, is this on? My name's Tenny. I'm from Chicago Foundation for Women. My question hopefully is short, but are there movements doing work at the same intersections that your organizations are that you feel have not been tapped into the gender-based violence movement? And what comes to mind for me is disability justice. And so do you have thoughts on how to bring not just that movement, but other kind of overlooked movements of marginalized people into this work? And what might your approach to that be, especially if you are not kind of that community?
Yeah, and I think maybe even Raymond could speak to this even more, but the immediate thought that comes to mind is not having pillars to your funding. Because the minute you have pillars, you separate everyone out, and so-and-so is not eligible. But really, I mean, all these foundations, they're all working towards the same thing. So if you could have disability justice organizers and gender violence organizers and racial justice organizers all within your portfolio, then you're essentially creating that ecosystem for conversation and collaboration. But we've all been so siloed, and we're all trying to break that. We're all trying to be like, let's all get together and talk. And but the system that we're operating within does not facilitate it.
I mean, I don't have much more to add. I think this question can be asked about, virtually every single movement. And for me, the answer is integration, right? Like, how do we start thinking about the vulnerability that people living with disabilities have, and where does sexual violence, gender-based violence come in, and how do we start to address that as a disability justice issue? Same thing with immigrant, and we have a Tahirih Justice Center works with migrants that cross the border, right? The narrative around immigration right now is off the chain, right? And yet the conversation around gender-based violence is nowhere prevalent in that. So, how do we start integrating and saying, we know this happens, if you're vulnerable and passing the border and going through this is about to happen. So for me, that's the simple answer, is if you have a racial justice portfolio and you have 35 grantees, look through those 35 grantees and ask the question, is anyone doing gender-based violence work at the intersection of racial justice and gender justice?
And I guess for us to wrap up, I would like to take that thread on and say, this final question is, what are like 1 to 2 concrete ways that we can continue to integrate ending gender-based violence as part of our funder strategies for any of the funders in the room? And let me start this off by saying part of this too is doing that analysis, finding those organizations that are already working on the nexus of ending gender-based violence, and whether it's worker rights, whether it's immigration, whether it's climate justice, and being vocal about it. To Sonia's point, I think the open secret sometimes in philanthropy is that it is it's a peer influence game, or that is such a powerful force in the sector that talking about it, especially if you are a program officer, program manager, or someone in leadership, continuing to talk about it with your peers and your colleagues and making noise about it is really a major mover in the game. Maybe can I ask just one from each of you, just like one proposition?
Yeah, I would just add to that, talk to fellow funders. If all of the women's funds or all of the Chicago foundations that are in and around this area all got together and said, we're each going to put an extra $1 million to this work, no one's going to be the one that says no. So we did a convening in February of funders at the Ford Foundation, and they were basically like all of my funders. They all came into the room, and I thought for sure they would be kind of annoyed that I brought them all together. Like, some of them some flew in from Europe to be there. I was like, I'm sure they talk to each other all the time. And I'd say almost every single person in that room didn't know at least 3 people in that room. So I don't think funders are talking to each other nearly as much as you can. And, just like for us as nonprofit organizations, there's so much power and collaboration with each other, and there's so much that we can do together. The same is true for foundations, as learned from the Collective Future Fund.
We have to wrap up, unfortunately. So if you would like to hear Aleyamma's contribution to this, let's chat outside.